Okay, I'm very proud and excited to present today's speaker. Well, it's not just today's speaker. I'm very proud and excited to present Nicholas Laccetti. Nicholas Laccetti is a Christian esotericist, a theologian, and a practicing occultist. He is the author of The Inner Church as the Hope of the World, Western Esotericism as a Theology Liberation, which you can purchase now if you're watching us on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. His writings have appeared in publications such as Patheos, Killing the Buddha, and Religion Dispatches. Nicholas holds an MA in Medieval Studies from Fordham University and an MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, where he focused on the interdisciplinary study of theological aesthetics and popular religion. Outside of his esoteric interests, he works in communications for the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, an institute based at Union in New York City. Nicholas, of course, will be speaking about Amor versus Roma, Josephin Peladan, the secret tradition from the Cathars and the troubadours to Dante. Nicholas, take it away.
Thanks, everybody. So just to give some background on this talk, it is actually originally a blog post. So I am going to be reading some of that, but I've also beefed it up since then with various personal opinions and other thoughts and anecdotes and kind of side issues. So I think it'll be pretty interesting. But the thing that I wanted to start with, that being said, is Josephin Peladan. If folks know or don't know him, I think requires a little bit of an explanation, especially in English-speaking circles. So Péladan was born in 1858, French, died in 1918, and is part of the French occult tradition in the latter half of the 19th century. Until maybe the last 2 or 3 years, Péladan was practically not mentioned in the English-speaking world. There still isn't any full translations of a book of Péladan out in the English-speaking world, except next month one will be coming out. So there's a certain amount of revival going on of his ideas and interest in his ideas. Some of that started 3 years ago at the Guggenheim in New York City, which did a exhibit on Péladan's, the art that Péladan kind of patronized through his Salons de la Rose-croix in Paris in the latter half of the 19th century. So he's starting to come back into like certain circles, especially the art world, and in kind of occult circles related to that. However, people still don't really talk much about what he said or didn't say. There's a lot of obscurity around him. We were looking up at dinner yesterday his Wikipedia page, and it said Péladan was a novelist and Martinist, which is actually like really, he was a novelist, though very few people actually read his novels at this point. And he was a Martinist. He was on the Supreme Council of Papist's Martinist order, but he also quit all of those roles to go found his own order, the Catholic Rose-croix, which has kind of most well known for patronizing these salons that he held in Paris in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, which featured mystical symbolist art. So that's kind of the way he's known in the contemporary world. There was a New Yorker article about him that kind of said, that occult stuff he did was sort of weird. We really want to talk about that. But he was an important influence through his patronage of symbolist art on the modernist movement and later art periods. So that's kind of Péladan. But this talk is not quite about that. It's actually about Péladan's understanding of the secret tradition. So Péladan, like most occultists in this time period, traced his work through a lineage of thinkers and movements all the way back to the ancient world. And so what I'm going to do is kind of unpack a little bit about what Péladan meant by the secret tradition, specifically stretching from the Catholic movement in the Middle Ages through the troubadours and to Dante. And I would like to offer the disclaimer at the beginning of this as I launch into it that we've had some great talks today that have really unpacked a lot of different kind of ideologies, thinkers, movements. A lot of the figures in my talk are actually some of the reason why we're confused about all of that stuff. So people like Péladan and others were not very good at historical scholarship necessarily. In many ways, they conflated a lot of ideas. Different movements, the subtlety of the thought started to be lost in that, especially when you're talking about medieval heresies, the Gnostics, secret societies. These things start to come in and out of many of these people's writings, and they serve different ideological purposes in their writings. And it can really differ from person to person in the occult movement in the latter half of the 19th century, why they're mentioning something and what it signifies for them. So I wanted to offer that disclaimer because some of the things in this talk are questionable historically, and maybe we can talk more about that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to study what these people were saying. So, Amor versus Roma. So, according to his successor, Emile Dante, Péladan's Order of the Rose-croix had 3 patron saints for 3 degrees. So, scholar of Péladan, Sasha Chaitau, who's the expert on Péladan in the English-speaking world, wrote, in Péladan's order, the initiates swore to Leonardo da Vinci for the 1st degree, to Dante Alighieri in the 2nd degree, and St. John and the Holy Spirit for the final degree of commander. So these oaths to Leonardo da Vinci, Dante, St. John, the Holy Spirit sound kind of eccentric and are not the obvious names you would associate necessarily with Rosicrucianism. The 2nd degree of Chevalier, which was an esoteric knighthood, in which initiates swore by the name of the medieval Florentine poet Dante, is especially linked to the Knights Templar. And Péladan claimed that he had a true affiliation with the Knights Templar through his brother Adrian Péladan. So he claimed that there was an existing Templar lineage in France that he was a part of through his family, that he was passing on through his own order. Now that's another one of these claims that you have to think about, is that true? However, Péladan's own order existed under a triple banner, the Rosicrucians, the Templars, and the Grail mysteries. So his order, both in the degrees and in their symbolism, relied on this kind of triple lineage, Rosicrucianism, Templars, and the Grail. But why during the 2nd degree do you swear by the name of Dante, rather than a more well-known Templar figure like Jacques de Molay, any other person that you would associate with the Templars, maybe historically? The answer really lies in Péladan's belief in the esoteric interpretation of Dante. And he was not the first person to give an esoteric interpretation of Dante. It was first espoused in the mid-19th century by Gabriel Rossetti, taken up by Péladan and incorporated into his order, and later reiterated not only by esotericists like René Guénon in his book The Esotericism of Dante, which is probably the most common place you would come across some of this, but also by writers like Ezra Pound, who's a modernist poet. So this is part of the reason why Péladan starts to come up in a lot of these histories, because his propagating of this idea about Dante and about other figures ends up into kind of mainstream literature through people like Ezra Pound. So these writers and esotericists believe that Dante's circle of poets, the Fideli d'Amor, was in fact an initiatory order of mystic chivalry. They weren't just poets who got together to drink wine and write poetry, but they were actually an initiatory order. According to Péladan and others like him, this order was centered around the divine feminine, embodied for Dante in the figure of Beatrice. These people often saw affiliation for this order in the movement of French troubadours, and ultimately traced that back to the Gnostic Cathars, the Cathar movement in the High Middle Ages. And this is perhaps the quintessential medieval heresy, and I think a lot of people in this room will know a lot about Cathars or be interested in that. So Amor, which is the watchword of the Fideli, which is the poet's chivalric love of the lady and the subject matter of his lyrics, was seen as a Cathar reversal of the word Roma. So you have Roma is the Roman Catholic Church, and then you have Amor, which is this counter church and this other tradition. So starting with the troubadours, going the Cathars, the troubadours, and then going through Dante. So already we're getting up against things that are like, is this true? Because the connection between troubadours and the Cathars has often been debated. I think there is a connection, but there's a lot of scholarship arguing back and forth. The connection between Dante and these things, not really. Most scholars of Dante probably would not say Dante was a theologian of the Cathars, but Péladan did say that. So Péladan didn't really stop there. Ultimately, he believed that the Cathars, the troubadours, the Italian Fideli d'Amor, German Minnesangers, the Scalds in Norway, minstrels in Wales, the Knights Templar, and finally Grail Knights in medieval Arthurian romance, were all one continuous tradition. And that this tradition, if you go all the way back, goes to Plato, Orpheus, the Eleusinian mysteries, and it represents an initiatory chain stretching from antiquity through the Middle Ages, and then through the Renaissance and the occult revival of Péladan's own day. And unsurprisingly, Péladan believed he was the representative now of this tradition. So, and as he writes in The Secret of the Troubadours, let's see. Does anyone want to read? Can anyone read this here? Oh, I can read it.
If one studies the hidden meanings of medieval literature, the Renaissance no longer appears to be a sudden resurrection of the ancient world. Neoplatonism had already penetrated our tales of adventure, and when it showed itself openly under the Medicis, it was because they assured it effective protection against the Roman Inquisition. Peladan, I suppose, and Marcio Ficino are the official teachers of old Albigensianism, as Dante is its prodigious Homer. That's fun. Fiction and history correspond with a striking similarity on this subject. Do not the Knights Templar represent in reality the Grail Knights? And does not Montsalvat have a real name, Montsegur?
Yeah, so this is a big quote, and there's a lot packed in here from Péladan, right? So what he's saying here is that modern esotericism that we often would trace to this Neoplatonic revival or Heretic revival in the Renaissance, it was actually in the Middle Ages. It's actually in medieval literature in our tales of adventure and chivalry. So he was saying that that Platonic and Ficino are the teachers of old Albigensianism, so they were actually theologians of Catharism, and that Dante is the equivalent of its Homer, and he was, through his poetry, he was espousing the Catholic doctrines in an encoded way in the Divine Comedy. And then even more, the Knights Templar are actually Grail Knights. The Cathars are Grail Knights. The Troubadours end up being Grail Knights too. So everybody kind of ends up being a Grail Knight. And Montsalvat, which is the castle of the Grail, or the Grail Castle, has a real name, Montsegur. So the final stand of the Cathars is tied in here with the protection of the Holy Grail. So the reason I gave that disclaimer is many historians would be like, no, there's a lot of things here that are not corresponding. But for occultists in Péladan's lineage and tradition, these things were all the same. And I would say many of us in our traditions of occultism also run into these ideas all the time. So there's some interesting things here, I think, that we want to kind of unpack a little more. The notion of a secret tradition stretching back from ancient pagan mystery religion and Platonism through the Gnostic tradition and the medieval Cathars, and submerged in legendary form in the Grail mythos and the poetry of medieval poets, would prove influential on many generations of French and German occultists. So again, Péladan wasn't the first person to say this, but he was transmitting it in a really influential way through his work in culture. One person who picked up on it, besides Ezra Pound, was Otto Rahn. Some folks might have heard of Otto Rahn. Rahn was a German occultist who ultimately served as a Grail historian for the Nazi SS. Officially, he was employed by Himmler to study the Grail. So he's kind of the prototype of the Nazi occultist in Indiana Jones, searching for these artifacts. So Ron went on these kind of quests to search for the Grail and wrote a couple of books about it. Ron actually makes a reference to Péladan as the source of his theories in the opening prologue to his book Crusade Against the Grail. So he was actually picking up on a longer tradition of French and German occultism in talking this way. So both Ron and Péladan understood this tradition, flowing from the ancient world to the Catholic movement and the Troubadours, and then from there into the Knights Templar, and finally into their own occult orders as a kind of counter-church of Amor, contrasting the Roman Catholic Church of Roma. For Ron, there's nationalistic and ideological reasons for supporting this. Ron was very interested in kind of obliterating this Judeo-Christian tradition in favor of this ancient European paganism. Now, a lot of people have said Ron was not really an avowed Nazi, and that seems to be true, and yet he was working in that same blood and soil nationalism that was going on in that time period. So the false demiurge, of which he attributed actually to Lucifer, which would not be a phrase that the Cathars would use for that. Or they would use that for the demiurge, but Lucifer for him was the high god, and the demiurge was this Judeo-Christian god. So there's, again, that's another kind of use of the terminology that starts to get spun around in different ways. For Ron, Lucifer was the good god. For the Cathars, Lucifer was the phrase for the demiurge. So it's easy to see why this would be appealing to some people in the Nazi party, because there is an element of a counter-tradition to this kind of conflated Catholic and Jewish, Christian, kind of, it's all from the Hebrew sort of thing, to look for this separate ancient pagan tradition that he saw in Cathars, which is really historically questionable. So that's kind of one of the more notorious uses of it. If we go back to our friend Péladan, who's right here with his great beard and his great robes, So Peladan's embrace of the counter-church was not at all the similar reason to Ron, even though they were both into that same tradition of the secret tradition versus the mainstream Judeo-Christian tradition. Sasha Chaitau points out that the word Catholic used in Peladan's order really means universal, so it wasn't really a partisan reference to the Roman Catholic Church. That may be so, but Péladan was also a muscular Roman Catholic throughout most of his life, so there's a lot here that's confusing ideologically. He was interested in this alternate tradition, and yet he was still a Roman Catholic. He saw himself as renovating the church in some way. He was going to bring the secret tradition back to the forefront and help kind of fix the Catholic Church in that way. So Péladan wrote in Tobias Churton's translation in his 1885 novel Curious, God must be for us the ideal that we shall have loved, and eternity will be the realization of our will. I will deny all collectivity. I will deny the work of blood. I will deny military glory. I will deny nationality. I will deny the heredity of the power and the titles. I shall proclaim humanism and the dogma of individuality. I shall renew the doctrine of Enoch, and kissing before the whole world the mule of the Pope, the sole power I shall ever recognize. So again, in that passage, you see a lot of things going on. Péladan only recognizes the Pope. He doesn't recognize European hereditary nobility. He doesn't recognize military glory. He doesn't recognize nations. Yet he's also saying he proclaims humanism, the dogma of individuality, the doctrine of Enoch. So he's already kind of combining some of these themes in the service of his own agenda, really. The same way Ron would do it in a very different way, like 30 years later. So in many ways, that passage seems to contradict an interest in the Cathars and the Troubadours, because most folks like Ron who were interested in the Cathars saw a kind of anti-church to the medieval Catholic Church. Péladan was an ultramontane Catholic who believed in the Pope. So what's going on there? So I think to figure that out, one of the ways that's helpful is kind of sorting back into where some of this came from, because again, Péladan didn't invent it. So to complicate it even more, you have in the 30s Ron with his kind of German nationalism. You have Péladan with his attempt to renovate the Catholic Church. But then going back another generation to Gabriel Rossetti and the people who first started to posit some of these ideas in the Romantic movement, there was also a Romantic socialist tradition that did this. So it wasn't originally for the purposes of spiritual esotericism that people were positing that Dante was actually part of this secret counter-church. It was folks like Rossetti, who were radical Republicans in Italy in the earlier 19th century, who posited that there was a lineage of radicalism stretching from ancient paganism through the Gnostics in the Middle Ages and in late antiquity, through the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and finally, again, surprise, to themselves. And they were now, the Romantic Socialist movement was the fulfillment of this long secret tradition, which was really politically radical, even though they spoke about esotericism. So again, you have a group of people kind of utilizing this idea of a secret lineage for their own ideological and kind of spiritual and political purposes, and that'll keep coming up again and again. So it's this tradition in the work of Gabriel Rossetti that saw the birth of the idea that Dante was in fact an esotericist. The same radical lineage, this kind of radical socialist political lineage, would be espoused by many socialists in France prior to the 1848 revolution, especially by someone who was originally named Alphonse Louis Constant, who we know better as Eliphas Levi, who is really the founder of what we now call Western occultism. So Levi, who's the guy who also had a nice beard, I don't have a picture of him, but is the person who first attributed the tarot trumps to the cats in the Tree of Life and many other innovations. He's the one who drew the Baphomet drawing that's now used in many different traditions of occultism. Levi was actually originally a radical socialist who was arrested many times for his political writings against the church. Ultimately, after the failure of the 1848 revolution, Levi kind of turned more to mysticism and magic, but he kept the same themes. So he brought in this idea that there's a secret tradition, that it's radical, it's opposed to the mainstream political and religious order. It goes back to the ancient world, but it goes through the heresies, and it goes through the Knights Templar, and it goes up to himself. And then he incorporated that into his history of occultism. So Levi, who is really the kind of granddaddy of like all of these French occultists, including Péladan, these later folks like Papus and Péladan would get these ideas mostly through Levi. So there really is this direct line, again, for very different reasons, through different figures who espouse this secret tradition. So still, it still kind of remains to be seen why Péladan, as a Roman Catholic, would valorize this counter-tradition to the Catholic Church. I think the answer is how Amor, as a spiritual ideal, ultimately relates to Péladan, to the Platonic theories of beauty and love. And this is really where the divine feminine comes into play for Péladan and for his interpretation of Dante. So, guided by eros or desire, as many folks here probably know, the Platonic philosopher moves from the love of physical beauty in the world, of his beloved, the person that he loves, to the transcendental love of the ideal. And we saw that a little bit in the previous presentation on temple theology. There's this idea that you start with the love of the physical world, but you move from that to the forms, and that this was kind of the aesthetic theology going on. So as one scholar summarizes in his book on Ezra Pound, the philosopher must, quote, learn to see that the beauty of a particular individual is interchangeable with the beauty of many others. Therefore, he will concentrate on the essence of all those beautiful human beings and contemplate what constitutes their beauty. Then this common denominator of all mortal beauty will be regarded no longer as bound to one person, but will be pursued in its ideal form, that which supplies the forms with its essence. Finally, the soul will ascend to a visionary knowledge of true beauty itself. So, again, we have a lot of themes that are written into the ascent. This idea of moving to the kind of the goddess in some way, this form that is ideal beauty as transcendental, and moving from the creation to the kind of the divine in that way. So tracing that idea through history and ultimately to Péladan, Liebritz, who's the scholar, quotes a beautiful passage from Plutarch in which he describes the role of eros in the ascent of the soul to transcendental beauty. And I'm going to ask, I don't know if somebody could read that. I could read it if people are too far away. So anyone wants to.
Love, who has come to it through the medium of bodily forms, is its divine conductor to the truth from the realm of Hades here. Love conducts it to the plane of truth where beauty, concentrated and pure and genuine, has her home. When we long to embrace and have intercourse with her after our separation, it is love who graciously appears to lift us out of the depths and escort us upward like a mystic guide beside us at our initiation.
Yeah, so I think this is a good kind of encapsulation of this ascent idea in the kind of Platonic form. And also, I love the last line, because those of us who are part of kind of occult societies, even Freemasonry, would recognize this idea of the guide beside us that's kind of guiding you in initiation. So that guide becomes associated here with the kind of the medium of the bodily forms, the love as the divine conductor, and also I would say Sophia. You start to see Sophia here, though he doesn't use that terminology. So you're kind of guided by this love, which is present in beauty in the physical world, but you're guided up from that in your initiation to the transcendental love and beauty, which could be the goddess, the transcendental Sophia. So this is where we get to why Péladan was so interested in this counter-tradition of Amor, and why it wasn't just ideological, but also a spiritual tradition for him. Péladan contrasted the marriage rites of Rome, centered around procreation, with the Platonic spiritual love of Amor. Péladan wrote, in the Provençal region, marriage meant obedience to the Roman orthodoxy, and love meant adherence to the troubadour doctrine. Such is the first key to all the love literature. So Péladan saw in the poems of the troubadours, where the poet writes about his lady, as a kind of encoded mystical poetry, kind of like the Song of Songs. So the poet seems to be writing about his lady love, who's so much higher than him, but actually the troubadour is writing about Sophia, or this transcendental beauty. And this was like an encoded way of propagating Catholic doctrine, according to Péladan. Again, whether that is the case is a little more debatable. So for Péladan, that stretches from that kind of ancient Platonic idea that we see here, through to the Gnostics and the Cathars, to the love literature of the Middle Ages, and then ultimately to Dante, who, as we know, through maybe reading Dante in high school or otherwise, was pretty obsessed with a woman named Beatrice, who he was never married to, may or may not have had that much interaction with, but she became for him this allegorized vision of ideal beauty in some way. So there's this practice here that you're starting to see repeated. So the Knights Templar seem kind of like an aside in this lineage, but just because I want everybody needs to have the Knights Templar in the talk. Dante and the Cathars were often also connected to the Templar order. Many occultists have suggested that Dante was an initiate or even a leader of a tertiary order of the Templars called the Fede Santa, whose dignitaries bore the title of Kadash, familiar from the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. This would explain, some of these folks, like Guénon, would say that Dante chose Saint Bernard of Clairvaux as his guide in the Paradiso because Bernard was the founder of the Templars and the writer of its rule. Again, I don't know whether that's true or not, but in this connection, René Guénon summarizes some of the links between Dante's symbolism and the 26th degree of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Prince of Mercy degree. So he traces this hodgepodge of symbols in this Masonic degree. There's the Italian tricolor flag, which was associated with this divine feminine symbolism. There was also the three theological virtues. Beatrice is actually draped in the colors of the Italian flag in the Divine Comedy, so there's that connection. The symbolism of numbers 3 and 9. There's the most excellent chief prince as kind of the presiding officer in this Masonic degree. That was seen as the incarnation of love, or Amor, who is the initiator, who was holding an arrow. And then above all, a statue of a virgin as an image of divine feminine as the symbol of that order. So many occultists kind of saw these connections here between Dante and this kind of esoteric symbolism. So Péladan and Guénon interpret this esoteric lineage of Dante this way, but Péladan was not really just interested in a scholarly kind of account of that. He actually saw his own order as continuing this lineage. So he saw Dante, as we saw in that quote, as the prodigious Homer of the secret tradition. So Péladan's own themes constantly bring back Dante and the associated symbolism through this secret tradition. So now there's a lot of different threads there, but we can now kind of gather them together, I think. This poster is Amon Jean's poster for the second Salon de la Rose-Croix in 1893. And does anybody, I have kind of the description, which is kind of boring, but does anybody want to say what you see going on here? Like, what's in this?
It's a rose cross.
Yeah. And who is this, I guess, is this?
Well,
No, it's Beatrice.
Beatrice is my guess. I don't know what the angel figure is.
Right. I think it could be, yeah. And then it's interesting what she's doing, I think, is that she's actually passing a lyre to somebody out of frame. Presumably it's Dante because of kind of his place in this mythos. So you actually see a lot of the secret tradition that I'm kind of describing here combined in this one image. So you have the Rosicrucian, the rose and the cross surmounting the whole scene. That's the symbol of Péladan's order. You have this interpretation of Dante where Beatrice is this divine feminine figure being led away by an angel. But you also have the myth of Orpheus and the lyre, which Orpheus was another favorite theme in Péladan's salons. And Orpheus, the Orphic tradition, being seen as one of the sources in ancient paganism of this whole lineage of secret tradition. So Orpheus seems to be passing the lyre to Dante in some way, and then it's all under, it's all in the service of the rose cross. You also, I think, see a sprig right there, which I'm not certain. It could be
Acacia.
It could. That was what my thought was. It's acacia. So in this interpretation of Péladan's, kind of what's being encoded in this kind of icon form, Beatrice is not just an earthly woman for whom Dante pined away. She's a manifestation of the divine Sophia, the immaculate wisdom with whom we must marry ourselves if we are to conceive the divine light within ourselves. So understood in this way, according to Péladan, Dante's hymns to Beatrice become hymns to Sophia, and Dante's journey through the three realms of hell, purgatory, and heaven in the Divine Comedy in order to find her recalls Orpheus's journey to the underworld to look for his wife, Eurydice, which is also an initiatory journey in 3 degrees, like Péladan's order. So you have this passing through these 3 degrees, kind of mystically through the cosmos. Péladan would summarize that, quote, the Italians gave feminine traits to metaphysical entities, and he was pretty much doing the same here. So this kind of Sophianic mysticism of the divine feminine that Péladan was kind of reiterating, he saw at work, as we've seen in the troubadours and in the Cathars. Tobias Churton, who's a scholar of this, summarizes the difference between Roma and Amor according to Péladan, drawing in all of these themes, the Cathars, troubadours, and the Grail. Quote, formal marriage was the yoke of the Roman Church, indifferent to love. But the troubadours did not think in terms of eros and agape. They thought in terms of love, pure, unattainable, incredible, massive, and amazing love. Péladan notes that for the troubadours, the lady is the doctrine. She is the locus of the she is the altar before which the knight sacrifices himself in service. Through her service, the knight perceives the Holy Grail. For the ideal lady is the Grail, and are we then wrong to suppose that the true meaning of the Grail is the womb that only the pure may enter into communion with? So yeah, there's a lot going on there. Folks might be kind of familiar with, let's see, well, I guess it's not here, so we'll just talk about it. There is the really familiar image of the emblem that Péladan created for his order, which is a dove descending into the Grail. Most people now are more familiar with that as the OTO emblem, which has a lot of complicated trademark and copyright issues. But Péladan actually commissioned that emblem for the front piece of one of his books. So that dove descending in the Grail, which you kind of see in this quote, the Grail becomes a symbol of the divine feminine. The knight or the troubadour has to devote himself to that ideal in some way and make himself pure in order to enter the Grail. This doesn't really get into it as much, but the association there with the Grail and the Cathars obviously is also a really long-term theme in occultism. The idea that the Cathars actually were the keepers of the Grail historically in some way, and that when the Cathars were destroyed by the Roman Church, the Grail went into hiding, and 4 Cathars escaped the destruction of Mont Segur and took the Grail. So there's a whole complex of legends there. So in that emblem of the dove descending into the Grail, you kind of see the process here. But how does one become pure in order to enter the womb of the Grail, according to Péladan?
Just one more quick note, that same image is still used by the Ordre Martiniste Chevalier du Christ. It's also like a really common image just in Christian symbolism too. Like the Presbyterian Church has a really similar image like that.
You see it in the Rider-Waite Tarot.
Yeah, the tarot. Yeah. So it's always repeated. Péladan saw it as a symbol of this secret tradition, but there was an innovation, I think, in Péladan that was not necessarily in some of these other uses, which is Péladan believed that aestheticism, aesthetic mysticism, was required to actually become pure in this way. So that's already implicit in his interest in the troubadours and in Dante, who obviously were artists who created literary works out of this kind of material. But Péladan would kind of conceptualize it even further in a theoretical form. So Péladan called it kaloprosopia, which was this idea of self-creation. So in Péladan's orders, and this is also why he patronized symbolist artists, you had to create as an artist in order to participate in kind of this transcendental ideal. That was like an active way of participation in this Platonic ideal. So like the troubadours would write these poems to their lady, you also had to try to put these transcendental Platonic forms into some sort of physical icon or some creation. For Péladan, it's the love of beauty that allows one to recall one's divine heritage and to reintegrate with God. As suggested by this Platonic lineage for Péladan's ideas, his aesthetics really follow the philosophies of Renaissance Neoplatonists like Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno. He also traces his ideas back explicitly to Plotinus and Iamblichus, and ultimately to Plato and Orpheus. So God is transcendental beauty, and though creation is fallen, traces of beauty remain in the book of nature. And the book of nature is the mirror of wisdom, or Sophia. And that's the responsibility of the artist initiate to find those traces, to bring them back together into these artistic forms, and to use those forms to initiate oneself into the ideal. So Péladan has a good quote, and I think this is in Sasha Chaitau's translation, this is from his kind of manifesto, which was, "Artist, you are a priest. Art is the great mystery. And when your effort leads to a masterpiece, a ray of the divine shines down as on an altar. Artist, you are a magus. Art is the great miracle and proves our own immortality." So for Péladan, it was less about kind of initiatory work in terms of ritual, though there's been debate about how much he really used ritual. But his kind of understanding of this was the artist is participating in this kind of process. So the artist creates the idol or the kind of icon, and then if they create a masterpiece, a light will shine down from the Platonic forms and inhabit that. So it was really a kind of god-making in some way. So yeah, these traces of the divine in the world, which is traces of Sophia, divine wisdom in the world, basically lead back up a ladder through the celestial hierarchies and an ascent back to God. So for Péladan, Orpheus really provides the archetype of that. Orpheus was the ancient artist who, using his artifice, his art, Orpheus was able to play celestial music on his lyre that would immediately bring back its hearers to their origin in the divine. So it was like the anamnesis, basically, this remembrance through his music would kind of snap you back up through this ladder to the transcendental. So the traces of divinity in Orpheus's music were so powerful they allowed him to charm Hades himself, temporarily allowing him to reclaim his wife from the underworld. And you see that kind of reiterated through Péladan's lineage, through the troubadours and through Dante, and then through to the artists of his own salons in the 19th century. So allegorically speaking, we have a myth here that suggests that art and aesthetics, when properly understood, allow the initiate to invoke the divine traces in creation, immediately reverting us back to our heritage in God. So this is why in that image, again, the figure of divine wisdom here, which is Beatrice, hands over the lyre to someone out of the frame. And this was the poster for his salon, so it kind of had this programmatic quality. The image suggests that though the divine Sophia might be seemingly out of reach in a fallen or fragmented creation, through the medium of the lyre, which represents art, music, and artifice, the artist initiate might rediscover the traces or signatures of wisdom in creation, and then ultimately recall his hearers or his viewers to his art into the presence of the beatific vision. So in this sense, and I think this is really telling with the acacia sprig, the lyre takes the place of the phallus in the myth of Isis and Osiris, or the sprig of acacia in Masonic legend. Also, we think of the sword in Arthurian myth, the lost word. It's this piece of, this kind of logos that allows you to participate in this creative process. So Péladan saw that throughout this secret tradition. So all of these legends do have something important in common. I don't want to deny this, really, which is in any discussion of the divine feminine especially. So all of the characters and figures in this history and in these stories are men. So it's not really a universal, necessarily, tradition in Péladan. Péladan said that the artist initiate really is a man. Orpheus is a man, Dante is a man. It does go back to that in some way. So Péladan's often been called misogynistic. Sasha Chaitau admits, quote, Péladan saw a profound ontological difference between men and women, namely that Adam Cadman started out, the celestial original human being started out as androgynous, but in the fall was divided into two sexes. And unfortunately, according to Péladan, Adam got the spirit, but the woman didn't. So the woman had this intuition, receptivity, all that kind of stuff. And I think this is misogynistic, unfortunately. I think that Sasha says that it's not, and that it's just like there's different essential qualities in terms of gender. I think I want to raise that and put it in the room so we can talk about it. But
separate but equal, rare.
Yeah. So you can see in the tradition how this could be very problematic, because again, it's always the story of the male lover writing about his ideal woman, who eventually he'll be able to transcend and reach the divine beauty, which becomes kind of feminized in this understanding. So that's that's a
kind of objectification of its own, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Even if you stick loftier ideals on it, it's still seen as a means to an end.
Yeah. So in Péladan, women could become fairies or princesses. That's what he actually said, which is like kind of hilarious. Men could become magi or mages, magus. So he actually had 2 books about this, which
How to Become a Mage, which translation is actually coming out.
I find amusing kind of that the How to Become a Mage is going to be the first English translation of Péladan. It's coming out next month, I think. And then How to Become a Fairy, which is the equivalent for women, is not being translated right now. And it might be. I mean, that would be great, but it would be. It's very vituperative in some sense. Like he's very anti-woman in the first few pages of that. So Sasha Chaitau would say Again, my opinion that this is problematic. Sasha says that it's not, and that we have to understand it a little more complexly, and that that Péladan was only attacking kind of the social ideas about womanhood that were in the late Victorian society, and not some sort of essential characteristics. But I think the essentializing of that is problematic itself. So there's a lot there to unpack, I think, especially when you're tracing it through a secret tradition that supposedly goes back to the ancient world. I mean, what are we doing here? So that's kind of the historical background and kind of the ideological background. And again, I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of different entry points here, and I said a lot, and I hope we can speak a bit about it. And it's full. Yeah, we got a lot of time, so hopefully we can have a conversation. But ultimately, the question of whether this is true, this secret tradition, I think that it's okay that we have legendary histories, but we have to think about what they mean ideologically. And in this case, especially in terms of gender, I think, but in a lot of other ways politically, like we've seen in the uses that have been made of this idea. For example, the Cathars, who are in the title of this talk, but are not really the main kind of characters. Did they believe these things too? To me, in my limited knowledge of Catharism, this is really not a good portrayal of what the Cathars thought necessarily, especially in terms of gender. The Cathars had female perfecti, that women could have leadership roles in the church. There was potentially this kind of slightly Buddhist sense that you should be reincarnated as a man before you could kind of leave your cycle of reincarnations. But that doesn't seem to have been universal with the Cathars. It seems like different groups of Cathars thought different things about this. For some Cathars, gender was definitely an element kind of the common understanding of this kind of fallen world. It was not part of your ultimate kind of identity. So this kind of inscribing through Péladan and some of these later kind of occult traditions where gender becomes kind of inscribed into creation, it's not necessarily there in some of the original works of these figures. So you have to kind of rethink some of that. I would say similarly with that, even Dante, who definitely allegorized and idealized the women in his life to serve this purpose, ultimately transcends a lot of that in the Divine Comedy, where Beatrice doesn't take him all the way up into the paradise. Ultimately, Dante's vision is Trinitarian, and that there was this Trinitarian vision of the world that transcends any kind of duality of gender or conventional understandings of identity. That creation was really inscribed in the divine love of the Trinity. So this idea that kind of flattens some of these people and kind of puts them into this one tradition can be, I think it's very important for us as occultists who have these histories, and yet we also need to know what's really going on in the background of these things. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot of issues with historic kind of scrutiny here, but I think Péladan's Platonic interpretation of Dante is very valid. Dante, interpreted through the aesthetic esotericism of Péladan, is revealed to be an artist initiate who, through his poetry, leads his readers on this initiatory journey through the spheres, to the heavenly Beatrice or Sophia, and through the 9 spheres of heaven in the Paradiso. And it was interesting in the last talk that we saw some of the symbolism of the rose, because ultimately, even though in the Dante's Divine Comedy, he goes through each of the spheres in paradise, when he sees them kind of from afar, like zooms out, it's actually a rose. So there's this sense of the one living creature kind of that's beyond kind of the, like, parsing it out. So Dante and Péladan as his interpreter really possess Sophianic mysticisms based on this veneration of the divine feminine, who's attained through this artistic, esoteric practice, and in Dante's case, through his poetry. So through the Trinitarian creation of the world by love, traces of the divine Sophia are found all over the material cosmos. And for Péladan, like for Dante, it's up to the artist initiate through his or her, I think, artistic practice to discover and concentrate these traces in creation into initiatory forms, whether that's ritual, art, poetry, statuary, whatever we do. As Dante says in the final canto of the Paradiso, in his attempt to describe his ultimate vision of divine light, he says, "O grace abounding and allowing me to dare to fix my gaze on the eternal light, so deep my vision was consumed in it. I saw how it contains within its depths all things bound in a single book by love, of which creation is the scattered leaves, how substance, accident, and their relation were fused in such a way that what I now describe is but a glimmer of that light." That's kind of the scope. So thanks for listening to that.
Thank you.
I was going to note a couple things you mentioned. You were asking about the connection, or talking about the connection between Templars and the Grail Knights, and I can't remember if it's Gretchen to Troy or Wolfram von Eschenbach, but I think it's Eschenbach, but in one of them you have the Templars and the knights in there that are strongly implied to be Templars, and in the Grail legend, and the other bit is that our keynote last year was Stephen O'Shea on the Templar, or on the Cathars. Yeah. And so if you want to dig into the Cathars, we've got the Cathars.
Yeah, I think definitely folks like Péladan and Otto Rahn thought that Parsifal was basically this encoded history of the Cathars in some way. So the entire idea of the hiding of the Grail and all of this was like a history of what the Cathars had to do when they were attacked by the Roman Church. So it becomes kind of an allegory there. And again, associating another medieval poet with this secret tradition. So basically all these medieval poets end up being proponents of this tradition.
As you mentioned, it strikes me, the whole thing about art as a part of the initiatory work. I can't remember which church father or heresiologist mentions, but talks about Gnostics coming up with their own gospels as kind of a part of their practice, or even evidence of their attainment. And so some of this strikes me as similar, that the work is the thing that produces the transformation, but it's also the evidence of the transformation. Yeah,
so I didn't get into this directly in here, and Sasha Chaitau does a better job of this, but Péladan actually did hold some Gnostic theological beliefs, specifically that angels created the universe and not God the Father, basically.
Very Martinist.
Very Martinist, But in an interesting way, because and I mean, I know that the dualism here is really debatable depending on the tradition. But for Péladan, it was a fall into the material world. But then those angels were also tasked with teaching humanity how to kind of pull themselves out of that. Yeah. So it's sort of like Lucifer, you screwed up, and now you're responsible for helping these people. So Péladan had this Luciferianism that's kind of complicated, where there was a fall, but then the fallen angels. Because in the Bible, the fallen angels are the figures that teach humanity how to create things. So if you read in Genesis, the fallen angels teach you how to build cities and artifice and like blacksmithing and all that kind of stuff. So for Péladan, that's where his creative understanding of how to create things comes from, is from the fallen angels. So yeah, there's a whole level there. Yeah.
I think it is, depending on which Martinist literature or material you read, in their kind of interpretation of kind of the Lurianic Kabbalah you have there, is that the primordial man, Adam Kadmon, isn't just fallen and imprisoned in the universe as such, as that he is the jailer. He oversees the containment of the the kind of base evil in the material after it. Over it and stuck in it at the same time.
Just a quickie, but was there a Mrs. Péladan, and what did she think of Rome?
I don't think that there was. So I think that for Péladan, part of his ideal was a certain type of celibacy. So it was kind of tracing back to this ancient Platonic kind of mysticism, where there were all these intense loves, but they were not supposed to be procreative, and they were not necessarily supposed to be consummated. So I'm not totally certain on that, but I think he did have some love affairs, but ultimately in his novels at least, and in his theory, you were supposed to transcend like the physical impulse of sexuality. So
I was going to say, doesn't that also tie in pretty much to courtly love and the troubadours explicitly in the sense that the person they were idealizing was not necessarily the person they were getting married to.
You weren't. So and
they were different people.
Yeah, it was always adulterous in some way. So it was actually, the troubadours wrote about the high-born lady that they could never really attain, and then if they did actually have an affair with them. See, that's part of the argument about the troubadour history in Cathars, because there are many troubadour lyrics that do talk about actually having sex with a woman, but some of the people that are saying, well, troubadours or Cathars are starting to, they kind of want, well, that's a failed kind of attempt. Like those were bad troubadours. So it's sort of, it becomes kind of complicated, in that way.
Yes. So I'm with you on the Péladan's general.
Yeah.
What do we do with it?
Yeah.
How do you put me thought into that?
So when I wrote the blog post, I was like very carefully not even touching some of that, which was just because I was being like I was just writing a blog post. But for this, I was like, I have to talk about that because it's there. And I think that translation, it'll be interesting to see what it does with gender in the upcoming translation, because I don't think inherently there's any reason. I think that you don't have to inscribe these ideas into human beings the way that some of these occultists did. You can, depending on, I actually don't necessarily appreciate the gender dualism in the cosmos kind of thing either, but I do think there are ways that people really embrace that, where it's not, the soul is ultimately not male or female. And for Péladan, ultimately the androgynous being was the ideal. It wasn't male, men weren't the ideal either. It's just that Péladan said, well, they kind of shook Adam Kadmon, and what fell out into the two different genders was these qualities. So there's no, that doesn't necessarily have to be written in stone. And I think part of it, going back through these traditions and understanding the way different figures use parts of them ideologically is to see that this isn't set in stone necessarily. There's all these things that could be true, could be universally true or transcendently true, but they get kind of mixed up and shaken out in different ways, and they don't have, Otto Rahn's usage of this legend was really dark, because it was the Nazi SS party really liked it because of the way it could serve their interests. So you don't want to say that any of these people have cornered the market on. So I think, especially somebody, I'm thinking again of Sasha because she's so influential in Péladan studies, but she's an artist initiate and creates this amazing initiatory art. So I don't think it necessarily holds up.
She's found a way to work it that
you can utilize it, and you have to be honest and clear about it, but you don't necessarily need to follow through on all of his ideas or think that he had this direct kind of knowledge of it. But I think if you don't talk about it, it's not going to work.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
Yeah.
I'm personally a little. I hope the translation of How to Be a Fairy book comes out, because I'm
it'd be really interesting. Right? Fairies or princess.
Yeah.
John.
Sorry, well, I'm just going to say, what figure from the past is not going to be problematic, what philosopher from the late 1800s. I saw tweets about Marx being an anti-sex worker from leftists, right? We can't burn the whole past down. We've always got to take what's good and leave behind some of the garbage.
Yeah.
So that's more of a comment.
Which is what these people did.
Yeah.
In some ways, because building this tradition, this lineage, legendary lineage, was in a sense, though they didn't necessarily have those words for it, kind of claiming what in the past was usable, I think, and they didn't care much about whether that would be a problem or not. They were like, well, Orpheus and Knights Templar and Dante, and this all makes what I'm saying, and they weren't really that worried. So, yeah.
And there's a lot of misogyny in the legend of Orpheus, right? The whole fact that he's torn apart by women, and Plato says that he refuses.
Who hasn't been?
Well, literally this time. Plato says in the myth of Ur that he's resurrected as a swan because he refuses to be given birth to by a woman.
Yeah.
And just, there's this levels and levels and levels.
And the other thing in the Platonic kind of origins is that Plato wasn't often talking, even though the troubadours wrote as men writing about high-born women, Plato, of course, there were younger men were often sometimes the ideal in the physical world of transcendental beauty. So it was not necessarily heterosexual in the way that we would understand it either. So, clearly some of these concepts were applied depending on different types of relationships and different cultures, I think. So.
I was just going to mention the quote earlier from Péladan about, when a masterpiece is created, and I think Sasha might have commented on it in the interview she had on the podcast not too long ago, but there's that kind of embodiment of the ideal is not too far actually away from and the Orthodox experts in the room of course can correct me, icons in Orthodox iconography, the idea that they're not just blessed artwork or blessed images, the kind of the idea of the I don't want to go as far perhaps as to say ensoulment or opening of the eyes, but the idea that it kind of embodies the type or the prototype or the kind of thing, that there's a real power behind icons properly made and blessed.
And then to view the icon as the person physically present.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why there's an icon present during confession.
And when you're talking about whether or not it's their right hand or their left hand, it's theirs, not yours.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for Péladan it kind of starts to cross over a little bit into ensoulment, which is interesting, but the source is the same. It seems like.
Yeah.
Like it's also Platonic, there's kind of Neoplatonic kind of ideas. of
Absolutely,
aesthetics and things.
yeah.
So yeah, I think a lot of the connection. I think Péladan probably went to a degree that would have been seen as problematic by Orthodox authorities, but yeah, no, I think it's similar. Yeah.
I love the idea of an artist kind of, like the final strokes on the painting, and like just doing the final stroke and kind of
The light comes
holding
down.
their breath. Like,
Yeah, is it gonna work?
Did I make one?
Yeah.
Is this a masterpiece?
Yeah. Mhm.
Ding! I got one!
Yeah, and I think we were talking yesterday about Satie, Eric Satie, and the musician, and pianist that
yeah.
was kind of Péladan patronized him as part of the Salon Stay rose-croix. So, yeah, this idea that this music would be initiatory, that was used as part of Péladan's order, basically. So Satie created piano pieces that were actually used in Péladan's kind of ceremonies too, and at his salon. So, yeah.
I think the idea of art being literally a form of salvation, that is, am I misreading that? That is kind of what Péladan is saying, right?
Yeah.
Which could also, going outside of this room, I think can really speak to the world that we live in now, the secular world, because I'm sure there's people in the room, people listening or watching the YouTube who have felt transcendence in art. Right, something that is literally a religious experience.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can take that farther than just having a transcendent experience to a form of salvation, to a, maybe not a permanent form of transcendence, but to a higher way of living, I find to be very powerful.
Yeah, I think so. Péladan has that great quote. I'm not going to remember now, but he says, you might know this one that Sasha quotes a lot, where he says, like, even if you close down the churches, you'll still have the museums, and that people are going to still have their transcendental experiences through that. Which is interesting, especially in like kind of the way he sort of predicted some of the way modern culture would go, and the way he's portrayed too, which is kind of interesting. Like we were talking last night that the Guggenheim, in their catalog for their exhibit on Péladan's work, pretty much obscures all this kind of occult stuff, which is they kind of think is embarrassing. But the art, they're really like that's still important, and that the way Péladan influenced modernism and like later art, that's like becoming like brought back into a critical understanding. So Péladan almost predicted that. He's like, well, you'll probably close down the churches, but you still have art.
So the food is here. I guess my next question is, Nicholas, are you hungry?
I'm hungry, but I'm happy to be done. If folks have any other quick questions,
I have an awful questions on that.
Sure.
What crossed my mind, this is probably off the wall. Oscar Wilde and the picture of Dorian Gray. Could it be a perverse meditation on Péladan of I create this platonic ideal in art, and that allows me to live a life of vice and not suffer the consequences?
I would say so. That I'm really good. So sorry about dinner, everybody. I was so
dinner can wait.
Dinner can wait. Because my original interest in a lot of this, especially like the reason I was kind of drawn to Péladan, was because I was really interested in the decadent movement, the aesthetic movement, the literary movement in the late 19th century, and so definitely Péladan was a decadent. He himself would be like, no, I'm opposed to decadence, but all of his aesthetics and his novels were in that decadent milieu. And so Oscar Wilde was drawing on Huysmans and all of these French decadent tradition to write Picture of Dorian Gray. And then, so he had a decadent novel, but kind of writing in this Victorian way where the main character is kind of like a Péladan type figure who's this aesthete who is like trying to experience the world and through sensations and all this stuff, and makes him into this like villain. Yeah, he succeeds at creating this piece, but it's evil. So it has the kind of Victorian Penny Dreadful kind of feeling. But yeah, it's the same tradition of decadent aesthetic writers. Péladan was part of that. I'm surprised Péladan's novels haven't really, I mean, they're really long and I'm told are really boring. But like, he was, his first novel I think was the Supreme Vice was like one of his best-selling decadent novels. So he wrote like 20 or 30. And they were all in this idea of like, he's going to regenerate French culture through his kind of esoteric and artistic practice. So the opposite of Dante.
There's such a nexus of I mean, you can draw in Rimbaud and Baudelaire and people like Nietzsche even into all of this, and there are threads that are drawing all of these thinkers together, and I think Wilde is definitely part of that.
Cool. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.